let me introduce our star guest this week. That's Tim Montgomery, who's been at the forefront of Conservative Party politics for, well, I guess at least 3 decades now. Inside the Conservative Party, his roles have included being a speechwriter to Conservative Party leaders William Hague and Iain Duncan Smith, Chief of Staff to Iain Duncan Smith, and a Special Advisor on Social Policy to Boris Johnson. Beyond the, if you like, confines of Westminster, Tim was the founder of ConservativeHome, co-founder of the news and opinion website UnHerd, and has been a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph and the Times, amongst others, and is a regular guest and panelist on a whole range of television and radio shows. Known by many as Mr. Conservative, he was considered by those inside the Westminster Beltway as probably the most influential Conservative outside of the cabinet over recent years. So his decision in December of last year to quit the Conservatives and join Reform UK rocked our political world. Well, I hope Tim and I are going to rock your world over the next hour. Tim, it's great to have you with us. You're down your local pub, I understand.
Yeah, I'm only drinking Coca-Cola, though, I promise. And no, I have various problems. I live in a lovely house in Salisbury. It's actually 300 years old, very small little terraced house, but occasionally the Wi-Fi breaks down. So it's decided to break down tonight. And so fortunately, my local pub is hosting me. So if you see all this sort of beams and that behind me, I don't live in a castle. This is just my home.
You just drink in a castle. You just drink in a castle rather than living in
exactly,
one.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Tim, look, it's great to have you with us. And we've had a few, many chats and discussions over the years, but a fair few over Christmas and beyond. Tell us about your decision to move to Reform UK. Specifically at the time, I remember you saying that the final thing that pushed you to make the move was the release of the immigration statistics, which just showed huge net numbers still coming into the country. But I think the last time I spoke to you, I teased you by saying that you must be the only man in history to have defected parties based on a statistics produced by the Office for National Statistics rather than something else. So I guess that was sort of the last straw that broke the camel's back. But tell us about the move and what led you to it, and how traumatic was it for you after your long history in the Conservative Party?
Yeah, well, first of all, Mark, thank you so much for hosting me, and it's a really good opportunity for me to talk at some, a little bit more length than I normally get to explain why I made the decision. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
And congratulations on all you're doing with popular conservatism. It really matters. Well, I think people who followed me over the years won't have been that surprised that I left the Conservative Party. One thing that my mum, my biggest friend and my biggest sort of critic, challenged me over was, she said, "You always are quite critical of Conservative leaders." And I had been for a long time. And I sort of examined myself about that and thought, am I just, someone who can't accept the inevitable compromises of politics? But as I look back on it, Nick Timothy, by the way, once joked that the only Conservative leader I ever approved of was Iain Duncan Smith. And there's some truth to that. But as I look back at the number of, last number of years, and think about what the Conservative Party achieved in the last 14 years of government compared to the 18 years of Thatcher major government, it was pretty thin gruel, to be honest. And I think something has fundamentally gone wrong in the Conservative Party. Fundamental. And I have my theory on that, which we may come back to. I don't think the Conservative Party has still come to terms with the massive failure of its time in office. I don't think it's begun to come to terms with it. And my explanation for why it has failed has led me to believe it basically is probably dying. It probably won't recover. It may recover in 10 to 15 years, perhaps. But I think we've seen all sorts of political parties across Europe die. And I think it's perfectly possible for the Conservative Party to die as well. So first and foremost, I left the Conservative Party. And sometimes I do wonder to myself whether I should have just left the Conservative Party rather than join Reform as well. And if I'm entirely honest, part of my reason for joining Reform was I kind of wanted to shock my former party into realizing the seriousness of its position. I think a lot of Conservatives think Reform is going to go away, that it's a temporary sort of presence on the political stage. I don't think that's the case. And I think the fact that it isn't temporary should really worry the Conservative Party. But to answer directly your question, why did I join Reform? You're right to mention that ONS statistic, but immigration really was, if there was one issue, it was the issue that caused me to leave the Conservative Party. How many times, Mark, did the Conservative Party promise to control immigration? Right from the beginning of the Cameron years, they said they would bring immigration down from the hundreds of thousands net to tens of thousands. They didn't. The Brexit referendum was probably won on immigration. If it was won on any particular issue, it was a decisive issue. Rishi Sunak promised to stop the boats. We could go through, excuse me, deal with my runny nose. We could go through the many times the Conservative Party promised to control immigration. But if you look at what actually happened, immigration was higher in the Conservative years, even than during the Blair years, when supposedly immigration was a problem. And so, for me, immigration was the decisive issue. I think it wasn't just the substance of the issue; it was the breach of political promise. You can't sustain faith in democracy if again and again a political party promises one thing and does the opposite. But net zero, crime, the level of tax. I think of myself, there are some exceptions which we may come on to, but overall, Reform's policy agenda is much closer to my own than the Conservative Party's.
Yeah, fair. That's probably true of me as well. I might come to my reasons why I haven't joined Reform there. But you said that you thought there was something fundamental behind it that explained these 14 years of Conservative failure in office. Talk us through that, because this is what, if you like, motivated the creation of PopCon. We've got a theory about what went wrong. We don't believe it was 14 years of glorious Conservative rule. By and large, it was colossally disappointing. And I often make the point that if a Martian had taken a snapshot of the UK in 2010 and another snapshot of the UK in 2024 and had been asked to guess who had been in office over that 14-year period, would probably have guessed Jeremy Corbyn in terms of the way that taxes, regulation, carbon net zero, wokery, immigration and the rest of it. But what's your theory as to why that went wrong? Because I think it goes a lot deeper than, for example, the foibles of different leaders of the Conservative Party or a lack of will. This does seem to be something considerably more fundamental to explain the colossal disappointment. What is it?
Yeah. Well, I'd offer two main answers to you. And I think I agree with, or I think what I anticipate you saying is about the accountability of various institutions. The fact is that the democratically elected politicians aren't really in charge, but we can perhaps come back to that. But for me, I don't know whether you followed Michael Crick's analysis of tomorrow's MPs. He does this thing on Twitter, X, where he analyzes who's going to be the next generation of candidates. I'm generally of the view that if you look at the kind of candidates that a political party is selecting, you have a better guide to how that political party will end up than if you follow the policy announcements of a passing leader. And if you look at what happened to the Conservative Party over the last 20 years, first of all, David Cameron had his A-list. Now, his A-list was 100 MPs, 100 candidates, 100 candidates, which we at ConservativeHome exposed. It was meant to be secret, but we reckon that people on that list would want to know that they were on that list. And we got a few to come out as tell us that secretly that they were on that list. And then we revealed step by step who the whole list was. And basically, there were some very good Conservatives on there, but it was clear what really motivated the construction of that list was whether they were a woman primarily, whether they were gay, whether they were an ethnic minority. And I'm someone who thinks that diversity does matter in a political party. I think if you don't have people who represent the whole of a country, you're missing out on understanding that country. But I've never believed in a sort of an arithmetic or formulaic attempt to do that. And so basically what happened, it wasn't just the A-list, but compared to the Thatcher major years, even the major years, what happened under David Cameron was that we started as a party. Sorry, by the way, old habits die hard, Mark. I still often refer to the Conservatives.
You still use the third person plural. Yeah.
Yeah. But the Conservative Party started to select people according to the criteria of the DEI world, rather than actually, it didn't really matter how conservative they were. And actually then continued, funnily enough, under Boris Johnson. When the Brexit referendum was happening, or when they had to choose candidates very quickly for the 2019 election, they chose people who were in favour of Brexit. They were often local councillors, local candidates, and they absolutely ticked those particular boxes. But actually, in terms of wider or deeper conservative beliefs, it was fairly shallow. You know, a lot of the people selected, they had views on trans or government spending or the environment that just weren't, I would say, authentically conservative. So that's one big explanation for what happened. But underpinning it is, why would the Conservative Party do that as a whole? And this is my fundamental answer to the question, is it's not, you know, people often say, why has the Conservative Party, which was the most successful political party really in the Western world, fallen as low as it now has? You know, they lost 250 MPs at the last election. You know, never really suffered a setback like that before. And my answer to my point, I think, would be that it's not a coincidence that the most successful political party in the world has fallen so far, because essentially the Conservative Party became very good at changing its leader, became very good at having the kind of candidate selection policy that meant it was in tune with the age, meant it was very good at ditching policies that would prove temporary unpopularity. But what has happened is that over time, rather than being in service of an objective, those political tactics have basically become the Conservative Party. Mm-hmm. The Conservative Party has become an election-winning project, completely unanchored from any sort of overall mission. And it's very rare, I don't know what your experience is, Mark, but when I speak to a leading Conservative minister, or shadow minister now, or MP, their conversation starts with the politics of stuff. And this is why I think it's a very difficult thing to change, because when you're basically making nearly all of your decisions according to what works electorally, and that's what gets you up in the morning, it's very hard to be something different, and it's very hard to persuade the public that you're different. And as I've got things about reform since I've joined I've not particularly liked, and I'm happy to talk to you about those. But the one thing that has really struck me about reform and keeps me absolutely sure that I've made the right decision is the conversations I have with the 5 reform MPs or reform members, is that their conversations start with how they want to change Britain. It's about immigration, it's about net zero, it's about the fundamentals. Whereas conversations I had with Conservatives were about how things position them to win. And I think fundamentally that meant the Conservative Party didn't have the stamina, didn't have the ability to run the marathon that actually changing a country requires. They're constantly distracted by the latest opinion polls and political tactics. And that fundamentally for me is why I fear the Conservative Party is fundamentally broken. I'd like to be proven wrong, but that's what I feel.
Do you think we've got a few questions, Tim, that touch on this, that it's become too broad a church? For example, Ashley Bauer-Dyke says, since Cameron, it seems One Nation Conservatives have opened the door to more liberal-leaning candidates at the expense of solid centre-right voices. Do you agree that the party needs to cast off these liberals and return to a truly conservative agenda? How can they cast those off? Jeff Mitchell asks, why has the Conservative Party allowed so many wets to become MPs? Isn't the problem in part the composition of the parliamentary party is now so divided? I mean, it's not a broad church, it's a goddamn cathedral, and out of sync with the grassroots, that it's very difficult to sort of pin down what the Conservative Party. It's not as if you like, the wets have decisively taken over and there is a kind of middle of the road centrist proposition. That hasn't happened. It's just there's a disconnect between the parliamentary party in aggregate and the grassroots. So if you were to look at Brexit, I think the parliamentary party split about 50-50, but the grassroots of the party split about 4-1 in favour of Brexit, for example.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. And my problem, though, actually, is that I don't think the grassroots are quite what they were. I think there's, the grassroots is quite, the number of Tory members now, I don't know exactly how many, because the Conservative Party sort of, the systems, it's quite actually hard to keep track of them. But
haven't you broken into the back end? Haven't you broken into the back end of the system? I thought this is what political parties did to each other these days.
I don't have Kemi's IT skills.
Right, you're not an engineer, evidently. Yeah.
No, I'm not. No, no. I think even amongst the membership now, that sort of, it does sort of seep down. And if you have a sort of political leadership in Parliament that thinks in one way, it does affect the members in some way. So yeah, the members are definitely sounder. They're definitely more conservative than the MPs, the candidates. But it's a general problem now. And it's, I think it's partly, look at political commentary in this country, Mark. How much political commentary is really about the horse race rather than the substance of, policy? It's much cheaper and much easier, frankly, for a Westminster correspondent to talk about how a political party is doing in the polls, whether a leader is performing or not, than it is to talk about the implications of their policy. I remember, I don't know if it's too rose tinted, but I remember newspaper coverage of politics being much more policy focused, and that's gone. So it's what I would say is, although I think the Conservative Party has the most sort of advanced case of this disease of over politicization, over electoralization, I don't think the Labour Party is that far behind. I don't think mainstream politics is that much behind. I don't think the grassroots is that different from, the parliamentary party. I think it's an infection of politics that we all need to be wary of. I think reform is least vulnerable to it at the moment because it's a new party. I could imagine in 10, 15 years' time, it could be as infected by it as possible, which is why, one of the things that used to be very important in America was term limits and the, constantly refreshing politics. I've become more and more in favor of that kind of thing over time. So this problem of over politicization isn't unique to the Conservative Party. And I think because I think it is so profound, and people watching us tonight might disagree with my diagnosis, but because it is so profound, I think we need to be much more aware of it and much more vigilant about its implications, and perhaps we have been.
And what you mean by over politicization, am I right here, Tim, is an interest in the minutiae of electoral decision making, and the game therefore becomes almost like playing a board game, that the objective is just to stack up as many chips as possible under your colour and to therefore declare that you've won. But there's no kind of plan about what to do in the event of victory. I mean, a board game just ends with a winner, but an election ends with a government. And if you've put it all into just, the only thing that matters is how we get to 326 MPs and, to hell with the rest, unsurprising that you don't have much of an agenda for government if you do actually prevail, right?
I agree with that. And let me give you another example from across the pond. When Obama passed his Affordable Health Care Act, probably something the Democrats wanted more than anything else in recent politics. And the consequences were they lost the Senate. I think they lost the House of Representatives. I get muddled up sometimes about the chronology. But basically, they lost the political cost of them passing affordable health care, Obamacare as it was popularly called, was huge. And if you are in the political mindset that I've just described, that's taken over the Conservative Party, you basically regard that as a failure. Actually, if I was a Democrat, I think that was a cost worth having. You've changed the country, you've got what you absolutely wanted, and there's been a political cost of it, but you will come back. And I think, the Republicans, it's sort of near example, is the Republicans changed the composition of the Supreme Court. They got a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court, which I think is the biggest Conservative achievement anywhere in the world in my lifetime. The implications of that for years to come will be huge. But the Republicans at the midterms, in the middle of the Biden presidency, they really underperformed, and it was blamed, the reversal of Roe versus Wade. But I would say achieving fundamental things, regardless of the politics, is what a sensible strategic politician will be about. And I just think we've lost in the Conservative Party, we've lost that willingness to take the cost of big, fundamental, far-reaching decisions. And that's how I probably would best describe it.
Yeah, I mean, the intriguing thing there, which is one of my rallying cries, is that oddly enough, pragmatism doesn't work, right? I mean, you could understand it even if you were frustrated if political party was run by technocrats who are experts at understanding opinion polls and just reflected back to the electorate what they wanted to hear and continually won elections. But the Tory party got absolutely thrashed in July with this approach, and we now don't know how low its base is. Let's move on to. I'm intrigued, as I think anyone who wants to save Britain is, about the rise of reform. But tell us a bit about your new party. We've had a couple of questions about it from from Jane Kendrick and from James Wright, asking particularly about the reform's constitutional setup. Candidate selection seems to be even more centrally controlled. Mayoral candidates are announced at sort of glitzy press conferences rather than being adopted through selection meetings. I mean, I've also joked that the Constitution of Reform appears to make it impossible to get rid of a party leader, whereas the Constitution of the Conservative Party makes it impossible to keep a party leader. so there are some big sort of differences between the way the two parties are structured. But how does that filter through to what the feel is on the ground, what branch meetings are like, what campaigning's like, what the sense of camaraderie is like, what morale's like in the camp?
Well, at the moment, I'm not even 3 months, perhaps just about 3 months a member. So I can't really comment about branch meeting culture. It's not something I've really been involved with. But the Constitution of Reform isn't ideal at the moment. It's not as democratic as I want it to be. But I think, you have to understand it in the context of how Reform is a new party. So, and you look at populist parties across the Western world, they do attract elements which aren't always savoury. And so the ability of Nigel Farage has seen this with UKIP. He's seen this less extent with Brexit Party, but certainly with UKIP. You do not want, in my view, like a pro-Tommy Robinson, faction to take over. And at the moment, the lack of democratization is, is partly the defense of the party from that sort of insurgency, that sort of entryism. Now, you will have noticed, of course, that Reform's membership has grown very substantially in recent times, particularly since Christmas, when they... Brilliant. Sometimes, isn't it amazing how little things like putting up that ticker of members, it sort of became a self-fulfilling philosophy, just a really simple thing that really powered a massive growth in membership. So anyway, that growth in membership, I think, will protect Reform from that sort of danger of entryism now. We need to profile and find out exactly who those new members are. But I think Reform will overtake the Labour Party in terms of members at some point this year. And I think then, and I will press this more on Nigel, who is probably the closer I've got. Reform has probably disappointed me overall in some respects as I've joined, Mark. I don't think it is as developed or as organised as I thought. But the more I see Nigel Farage, the more I realise he is the absolute consummate politician. He has judgment and ability and a popular touch that we just, he really has impressed me to an extraordinary extent. But I will certainly argue to Nigel that the party needs to be more democratized, because I think it doesn't look good at the moment how centralized the Constitution is. But for the reasons I stated a moment or two ago, I understand why that was the case.
Yeah, that's interesting about Farage. I probably should also have said at the top of the show that another issue we should touch on, given you're a devout Manchester United supporter and I'm a devout
Can you not
Southampton
mention
supporter.
that, please, at the moment, Mark?
Yeah, well, I'm sharing the pain as a devout Southampton supporter. I thought we might do a poll on who's underperformed the most in the last 9 months, Manchester United, Southampton, or the Conservative Party. But on Farage, who is a phenomenon, it's impossible not to admire him, really, even if I think it would be impossible not to admire him, even if you completely disagreed with him, whereas I agree with most of what he says. But is there a one-man band issue? And Donald Blaney, good evening to you, Donald, asks a question with a football twinge to it. Bruno Fernandes, that's a Manchester United star player, has shown that being
our only star player.
Your only star player. Well, it's one more than Southampton have got. Bruno Fernandes has shown that being a one-man team is dangerous. How worried are you that Reform UK has too shallow a bench and that if Farage fell under a bus, it would struggle? Bill Etheridge asks, good evening to you, Bill. Good to have you with us. Similar question. Isn't the issue with Reform the same as the issue was with UKIP and the Brexit Party before it? Its popularity is almost entirely based on Nigel. And should Nigel suddenly decide he wants his life back again out of the blue, then Reform will sink. To some degree, it's we're flattering Nigel Farage here. It's incredible that you can build this machine around the energy, charisma, foresight of one man, but it's also pretty dangerous, isn't it? The whole thing could theoretically collapse.
Yeah. Well, look, if Britain had a presidential, gubernatorial, or mayoral electoral system, I would be very optimistic of Nigel Farage winning the next election. That he's good enough. He really is good enough, and he's genuinely patriotic. The fact that he stood aside from the election in 2019 because it was much more important to him that Brexit got across the line than Brexit Party won seats. He fundamentally, when he says he believes in stuff, he believes in stuff. I have huge admiration for him, and but just between you and me, Mark. Now, no one else is listening, are they?
Yeah,
so,
plug your ears for the 112 people on the call. Yeah.
His problem is, his management of a populist party has meant control of that party, getting rid of unsavory elements has been incredibly important to his success. So the trouble is now, if Reform is to move to the next level, he has to somehow realize that tendency of his, which was a good tendency up until now, might become a problem. Reform's great challenge is to find 350 people between now and the next general election who are up to being parliamentary MPs, who therefore haven't got the sort of skeletons in the cupboard that newspapers will so love to exploit, who are of potential ministerial quality. He'll need 90 odd people to run Whitehall if he was to become a majority, come Prime Minister. But also 90% of the time are happy to be lobby fodder and just take whatever the party leadership wants. Those people also need to have a realistic expectation that despite costing huge amounts of money and personal exposure, they may not even become an MP, such as the vagaries of our politics. So finding 350 people who tick every single one of those boxes simultaneously is really hard. And it's probably why I think you've got this poll, I think, running during our YouTube together. It's probably why ultimately I think Reform's success will be in forming some sort of alliance with the Conservative Party than winning outright. I think it's too early to be defeatist. I think Reform should definitely use the next year, 18 months to try and maximise their potential, and perhaps those 350 candidates can be found. But my God, don't underestimate how hard it is to find those 350 odd people who tick all of those boxes. It's not a normal package. You normally have someone who's very able, who won't be willing to be lobby fodder, or perhaps someone who's willing to be a servant, but then couldn't be a very good minister. And it's not an easy task. And I'm not sure Reform have yet fully focused on how they're going to deliver that. candidate search.
Yeah, this is interesting because you've brought together. I would agree with you if I was a member of Reform or advising Reform rather than a member of the Tory party. But you brought two things there, which I think are rather different things. The first is the vetting process, right? How do we make sure that we're not taken over by, the 50,000 new members aren't all previous members of the BNP and advocates of the Stormfront website or whatever. The second is, how do you find a coterie of people who could be cabinet ministers, members of parliament? I mean, I would add on to that as well, sort of senior bureaucrats, right? You need 2,000, 3,000 bureaucrats to run the country who you need to at least be able to count on some of them. So why not? Why doesn't Nigel Farage, for it was he we were talking about, devolve some of this, get someone in who is brilliant at vetting. I mean, it strikes me as a important job for Reform, but I mean, not a particularly challenging one, right? I mean, you look through everybody's social media posts, you take up references, you interview them, you try and tease out whether their views are simpatico or not with the party. And I would think you want to apply that almost to the entire membership. I mean, certainly to those who are running for local council, and you have a disciplinary process that if something comes up and somebody, denies the Holocaust or something, you kick them out. It's a rather separate thing to go out and recruit your, potential 350 MPs, or if you weren't even being as bold as that, a bridgehead of maybe 100 in the next parliament that might influence the government. Those strike me as two separate tasks, neither of which play to Nigel Farage's comparative advantage. He probably just needs to devolve that to Richard Tyson, James McMurdoch, or Rupert Lowe, or you, and just say, get on and do this. Meanwhile, I'll be all over the television studios and speaking at rallies, doesn't he?
Well, I think he has devolved it to some extent to the new party, well, not so new, but the party chairman, Zia Youssef. And Zia is an incredibly impressive person. I don't know how much you know about him.
I've met him once.
If people want an introduction to him, I really recommend a recent interview he did with Nick Robinson for Nick Robinson's regular podcast. And he's a very successful businessman, really switched on, and he's I think overseeing the certainly the vetting process. I think you're completely right, though, Mark, to say there are two different tasks. One is there's a talent spotting, and one there's a vetting, and they're actually fundamentally related, but they are different. But Zia has that task, but I don't know whether people are aware, really. It's just like, at the moment, Reform are still a pretty small operation. I think I'm right in saying they've just moved into Millbank. I think they've got 20 full-time employees. You think about the volume of new members, the correspondence, the policy development. 20 people is nothing, compared to the task. Vetting alone is something that you would, maybe they'll get an outside agency to help oversee it. But no, Zia Youssef is certainly beginning that task. He's the right person, I think, to do it. But it's still a very difficult one, even if you've got someone as competent as him in charge.
Well, let's talk a little about the. To what extent do you think Reform UK needs to find these people, including staff potentially, who are presently in the Conservatives, and where I mean, I would be. You're presumably in the business of trying to get people to defect. I'm in the business of trying to stop them, I suppose. But what do you make?
That's a really important point, by the way, you just made. I think Reform should be choosy about who they take. So for example, someone close to popular conservatism, what should Reform do if, say, just for the sake of argument, Liz Truss applied to join Reform? Now, my view is that we should turn her down, but she's a former prime minister. Sorry?
On what grounds?
I just think that she's you look at, I think she's got the lowest sort of approval ratings of any recent prominent figure in politics. I think.
But that's not a requirement to be that's not a requirement to be a member of the party, right?
No, but if I think she wouldn't just be an ordinary member of the party, would she? Every time then she appeared on television or media after joining Reform, she'd potentially either benefit or, in my view, contaminate the Reform brand.
But you're as bad as the Tory A-list at this point. You're now
Yeah.
just wanting to recruit people who are popular. I thought you were different. I thought you wanted to recruit people who agreed with you. Here I stand, I can do no other. I thought all of this, looking at the focus groups and the opinion polls about whether they like the makeup and the tie of one of your candidates on television, that was all old school Cameroonian nonsense, I was told 20 minutes ago.
Mr. Littlewood, you know, when I start talking to you, Mr. Littlewood, we're in serious waters here. Look, of course, it's fundamental that you want someone to agree with you on the policy. Absolutely, we're agreed on that. But we aren't just a debating society. We are a political project.
Yeah.
And a political project does require that you to be associated with people who can win votes. Liz Truss lost her own seat at the last election. I have more sympathy with some of her criticism of the Bank of England, for example. I think her basic analysis that Britain is run by a series of bureaucracies and unaccountable organisations, that politicians haven't faced up to, is fundamentally right. There's a lot in Trussism that I admire, but she's a vote loser. And I think you do have to be aware of winning votes in a political party. The problem I had with the Conservative Party was it took over them. It became the only thing that really mattered. But I don't think you and I will ever agree on Liz Truss, so perhaps we should park that one for the time being.
Yeah, so and I didn't want to over-personalise it too much, but do you think there a chunk of leading lights in the Conservative Party? I mean, you can name names if you want. We all know who they are, who you think would be a great asset to reform. Because you mentioned that sort of, imagine a world, which I have to say, I think is quite a long way off still, in which reform win the next election. I mean, of your imaginary hypothetical 350 MPs, I guess it would be handy to have a handful that had some form of ministerial experience at some point in their career. Being bright and up to the job probably isn't enough. And if the tally is 0, you could imagine it being a bit more like the Trump 1.0 administration, were this particular hypothetical to arise, rather than So, are you desperate to get, I don't know, Suella Braverman, David Frost, Robert Jenrick? I have no reason to believe they're on the verge of defecting myself. No. But are these sort of people who are in the absolute top of the sort of target list for trying to get them to transfer?
I am not the part of the inner circle of reform. Let's make it absolutely clear. When I joined Reform, wearing my Man United top, do you remember that, Mark? Which is not the greatest photo opportunity that I wasn't. Just shows how I wasn't as planned and my defection on that day as it might have been. But I said to Nigel Farage, "Do you really want me?" It was a pain in the backside sometimes of the Conservative Party, and I'm a journalist. Fundamentally, now I'm a journalist, and I will speak my mind. And so I said, I don't ever take any money from you. I don't want to be a candidate. I will be an independent commentator, a supporter of reform. I will certainly go into the media to back you where I agree, but I'll be independent. So when I speak like the whole of this hour, I speak for myself. I don't speak for reform. So I'm not aware of any strategy, any target list of Conservative MPs. What I would say is 2 things. One, I would love those 3 people you've mentioned, Suella, David, Robert Jenrick. All of those people I think would be very good. But I think it also matters, by the way, to recognise, and this is relevant to the conversation about a pact. And you mentioned Corbyn earlier as someone who could have been behind a lot of Tory policies. One area where Reform members are more Corbynista than they are Conservative is, for example, their attitude to big business. Now, you and I think, would recognise, an aversion to crony capitalism. There's nothing inconsistent with free markets and that. But whereas I think the average Conservative member and average Conservative MP, sort of slightly deferential to big business, things residual from the 1980s perhaps. But the average Reform member has as much problem with their experience of big business often than with big government. And so the Reform shouldn't just be in the business of recruiting Conservatives. I think there should be other people in other parties we should be after as well. And the second answer to your question was, I don't know what you thought of Rupert Lowe's stewardship of your beloved Southampton, but there are ways of getting people of talent into a Reform government who've had business experience. They don't necessarily have to have had ministerial experience. And Rupert Lowe strikes me as someone who could run a government department with real ability, and probably his business experience means he's much better prepared than perhaps some politicians who've been involved in Whitehall for a very long time.
Yeah, that might be true, but you'd have to clone him 25 times, right? I mean, that's the...
Well, there's only one of them, that's true at the moment, but there's only 5 Reform MPs. It's a lot of growth needed.
So let's move on to how relationships between the Conservative Party and Reform might develop. At PopCon, we say we want some form of rapprochement, some form of alliance or understanding on the right. From my point of view, I don't really care what form that takes. I'm completely open-minded about whether there's a pact or a merger, or 3/4 of the Reform Party and 2/3 of the Conservative Party get together and the wet wing of the Conservative Party disappears and perhaps a small problematic wing of Reform disappears. I'm completely open-minded on that. But it does seem to me we're in this odd position. I'm not saying this will prevail all the way through the Parliament, that you could have a opinion poll showing a split of, in rough and ready terms, 25% each for Conservative, Labour and Reform, yielding the Labour government being re-elected. I mean, this would be a monumental abdication of responsibility, I think, by anyone wearing either a blue rosette or a teal rosette. Nigel's fond of talking about country before party. There needs to be a point, doesn't there, when heads are banged together. I accept at this stage in the Parliament there might be some shadow boxing, but at some point, were anything like these numbers to pertain with an election dawning, you would have thought some arrangement would have to be entered into. And I think we'll put up a poll now about what people in the audience think the relationship between the Conservative Party and Reform should be.
What's that poll saying?
So the choices that we're giving people, you and I can't vote whether they think the party should merge, whether there should be an electoral alliance, whether we should build a better working relationship but no formal electoral alliance, whether we should contest all elections against each other under different banners, or not too sure or too early to say. Those are your 5 options.
Yeah. Oh, I can vote, Mark.
Oh, can you? Okay.
Yeah, I've just put I've said not too early to say is my answer.
So it might be too early to say, but that's on form rather than substance, right? Yeah. And you know, the intriguing thing about Nigel Farage, I'm being a bit cruel on him here, but in terms of his electoral arrangements with other parties, or in particular the Conservative Party, which is the only one that matters, he seems to have 2 modes. One is all-out war, and one is unilateral surrender. So in 2019, it was sort of unilateral surrender. I'll do the right thing. I'll sort of step aside from incumbent Tories. I'm not sure that was exactly the cohort he should have picked, but nevertheless, you know, gracious, noble, for the sake of the nation, nothing in return, not even a letter of thanks. Disgraceful, really. But then come 2024, there's absolutely not a single Conservative I will stand down for. So it seems a rather binary approach, and I think I'd encourage, and people in PopCon would encourage, slightly more imaginative thinking between all-out war on the one hand and unilateral surrender on the other.
Well, I'm going to whisper this very quietly to you, Mark, but behind the scenes, whenever I speak to people, this doesn't include Nigel, actually. I've deliberately not really addressed this with him, partly because I can answer you saying, well, what does Nigel really think about it? By answering very honestly, I haven't spoken to him about it. But generally, when I speak to both Reform and Conservative, I still talk a lot to Conservative MPs. It's the topic they all to talk about. So those that publicly say, oh, well, this is, you know, not for now, they're all obsessed with it. And they're all obsessed with it for all the reasons you've alluded to. If we end up a division on the right, and you know, for shorthand, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think Reform is a more interesting party than just calling it off the right. But a division on the right, if it lets Starmer back into power, that would not be good for either of the Conservative Party or Reform's interests, or for that matter, for the country. And I don't actually think we have that long to confront this, because once one of the parties starts choosing candidates, so if I was leader of the Conservative Party, I would learn the lesson that choosing candidates early, getting them sort of rooted in associations and rooted in their localities, is incredibly important for winning. So once the Conservative Party has started to choose candidates, once Reform has started to choose candidates, having an arrangement whereby, for example, the Conservative Party stands down in the 92 seats in the north where Reform are second becomes much, much harder. Now, part of this can be addressed by sequencing of candidate selection. So, for example, if the Conservative Party starts going slow in those northern seats, you'll know perhaps that's the sort of way of the Conservative Party communicating that they are interested in this alliance. If Reform prioritises those seats in the north rather than sort of more conservative Lib Dem marginals in the south, you'll realise that that Reform are open to this. But actually, a decision can't be taken 6 months out from a general election about an alliance. You basically need the positioning of both of the parties by the middle of this parliament. The contours of the next electoral fight will be clear, and if they don't sort of have an unwritten or a subtle agreement by then, it'll be too late. Does that make sense?
That does. It's interesting. I mean, a good number of people are obviously asking about this question. Derek Tipp says, do you accept that the right cannot win unless Reform and the Tories form a pact? Ruth Eads says, how can we reach an arrangement with Reform to prevent a second term for the left? There's a lot of people who are intrigued by this. I mean, doesn't it?
Can I ask you a question? You may not know the answer to this, Mark.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of whether it's you'll be more familiar with your correspondence and members than I am, but are Conservatives more interested in this Reform pact, or is it rarely? Because my experience is that Conservatives are certainly more interested in this alliance than Reform members. Reform members, when they say they don't want it, I think they're more genuine at the moment. So
yeah, I would say that's true. It's probably a reflection. Well, not so much of the spot price in the polls, but the trajectory, right?
Yeah.
So, Reform probably, I don't know, an average of a couple, 2 or 3% ahead of the Conservatives in the average of the polls, but are obviously, kind of walking on air at the moment. A breakthrough in the general election for Reform, whereas a cataclysm for the Conservatives.
Yeah.
And then since then, the Conservatives have had a pretty ropey 9 months, haven't made progress in the polls, have done quite well in local council by-elections, actually, the Conservative Party. But, it's obviously been a traumatic, rather desperate period for those in the Conservative Party, whereas I can sort of see, to use another football analogy, Reform are like they've just sort of been promoted to the Premier League and have won their first 3 or 4 games and now think they can sweep all before them because, the trajectory's in that direction. Whereas the Conservatives are a bit like your beloved Manchester United, once glorious.
Okay, that's the second
now
mention.
hovering above the relegation zone.
I'm going to press the ejector button if you mention it. It's too sore at the moment, particularly after losing to Fulham on penalties at Old Trafford yesterday. But
yeah, sorry about that. Much to play for. Look, well, I'm not sure there is anything to play for.
No, we're out of Europe. Our season's over. Yeah.
Well, I can give you the results here. So this is just a snapshot of 100 or so on this call. Which following best describes the relationship you think should exist between the Conservative Party and Reform UK? Merge, 6%. Electoral Alliance or Non-Aggression Pact, 39%. Build a better working relationship but no electoral alliance, 19%. Contest all elections against each other under different banners, only 7% of people on the call said that. And not sure or too early to say, 29%. So you were in that category as well. I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to preach a bit here, I mean, on my side of the fence, but I'd be interested in whether you could use your good offices as well. If at some point down the line, one might consider marriage between the two parties, or at least a very intimate friendship, if that's sort of on the agenda, then it seems to me that prior to that, we should go on a few dates. And prior to that, you probably need a certain degree of kind of respect and courtesy in the way that you're talking to each other, right? Otherwise, you never go on a date, or the date will go very badly if you do. And I'm a bit worried that it's on both sides. There's a sort of everybody throwing brickbats at each other, rather than saying, look, it's too early to talk about that. There's a good number of people in the other party I've got a lot of time for. But, we're miles away from an election. It's very important on our side of the ledger we do A, B, and C. Far from it. I mean, that ridiculous argument over who's got the more members. I mean, I thought both sides, it's a sort of slightly children's playground argument. I mean, I get for Reform, it generated them good publicity and probably good levels of members. I think Kemi misplayed it and probably would accept that she misplayed it. But the more we get into those sort of scraps, rather than just sort of saying, actually, it's quite a lot we agree on, even if we're wearing different colour rosettes, the harder that first date becomes, and then the harder subsequent dates or a more intimate relationship becomes. Is that not right?
Well, I think one of the big, I've already made the case that Nigel has swallowed his political interests before and been willing to sort of put aside his immediate political interest to basically give Boris Johnson his majority in 2019. Mm-hmm. I think Nigel will make the right decision should it be necessary. I am much more worried about Kemi rather than the Conservative Party. And look, I don't blame Kemi. I think, in the explanation I gave earlier for why I left the Conservative Party, you notice I don't think I mentioned Kemi once. I think, the most able of leaders at the moment, who are there in charge of the Conservatives, wouldn't be able to address those fundamental problems I discussed. But in terms of the question you have just asked me, I think Kemi is a problem. She's not someone who really listens widely to other people's opinions. She is not really a team player, in my view. And some of her behaviours over Christmas, when she was criticising reform for the membership, were ridiculous, and she's never really apologised for them. So I think, I don't know, it's not my issue anymore, although I note your comment about how often the Conservative Party does get rid of leaders. I think she's the bigger problem at the moment in being open to alternative views with her own party, let alone working with another one. But where the Conservative Party goes with its leadership over the next few months, I don't know. But I could imagine, for example, Robert Jenrick, if he was to take over the Conservative Party, being much more flexible and much more easier partner for reform to work with. And I think he's more aware than Kemi of how broken the Conservative Party is.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, in Parliament, whether they could work together a bit more, that if, I mean, if Rupert Lowe puts forward some really good amendment to some bill, I don't see why the Conservative Party front bench shouldn't sign it, and vice versa. Those sort of...
Well, I'll tell you why, and this comes back to, I think, I don't exaggerate this, but if the Conservative, if you have the average Conservative MP in some sort of blind quiz, and you ask them, who would you rather pair with? Would you rather be in government with the Liberal Democrats or with Reform? I think a quarter to a third of Tories would choose the Lib Dems. And I think
amongst the 121 MPs, you mean?
Yeah. And so I think that is what was the best thing that Boris Johnson did when he was leader of the Conservative Party? I would say it was getting rid of those 21 MPs who opposed the Brexit referendum, basically the passage of the Brexit referendum. It was hated by the Westminster Village. It was seen as, how could you expel someone like Ken Clarke from, the party? But actually, to the average voters, you couldn't have sent a clearer message that we were serious about passing the referendum. And it was an act of extraordinary political courage. It was political genius, and it confounded all conventional wisdom, and really gave the Conservative Party the chance at that general election that it didn't have when Theresa May was in charge. Now, there isn't a direct equivalent for the current Conservative Party leader, but I think if the Conservative Party started to take, for example, very clear positions on the ECHR and said, if you don't want to back this, go. Take it by the middle of the Parliament so you can choose other people to fight their seats. But start to make it clear that if you basically are a closet Lib Dem, you're not welcome. And so, the Westminster Village would say, oh, the Conservative Party's in crisis, it's divided. The electorate would notice that the Conservative Party was beginning to sort of take the kind of positions that a traditional Conservative voter would expect. It's a gamble, and it would have lots of downsides, but that's what the Conservative Party, if I was advising the Conservative leader, not that Kemi Badenoch would listen to me, but that's sort of risk that I would advise her to take. And the Conservative Party's stables do need to be cleared out.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, if the Conservative Party is going to return to office and remain a major force in electoral politics, it has to do this not as simply sort of shock and awe for a day or two of headlines. But I've reinvestigated the collapse of the Liberal Party 100 years ago to see if there's any lessons that one can learn from it. And actually, my takeaway lesson, although the conventional wisdom is Lloyd George and Asquith fell out and then started running candidates against each other, well, they actually fell out on some pretty major issues, in particular, whether or not you should have conscription to fight a world war. Not an issue that it mattered really what line you took until 1914, right? So the Liberal coalition could hold together for the preceding decades and run a government, even if simmering below the surface was. And I wonder whether the Conservative Party is in a similar position, that the sort of things that held the Conservative Party together, being broadly pro-business, pro-capitalist, anti-Soviet Union, pro-Britain's national institutions, the monarchy, the police, the army, was kind of enough to keep, I don't know, Ken Clarke and John Redwood in the same party for sake of arguments, because the other issues, it didn't matter in the 1980s really what your stance was on carbon net zero or ECHR. They probably would have intellectually disagreed, but it didn't matter. Whereas now the defining issues of our age are carbon net zero, ECHR and immigration. I suppose also attached to ECHR, where you stand on global institutions as a whole. So, you probably, if you're skeptical about ECHR, you're also likely to be skeptical about Davos and the World Economic Forum. You're likely to probably be skeptical of the World Health Organization and the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera. Wokery, I know that's slightly hard to define, but that's now
come over to reform.
I think there's going to have to be a rapprochement. I rather agree with you. If you got to a position in which the Conservative Party and the Reform Party's key stances on these issues, positions, and I'm imploring Kemi Badenoch to take some positions. She doesn't need the detailed policy. Leaving ECHR is not an immigration
analogy you sometimes use.
Sorry?
I like the restaurant analogy you sometimes use.
Yeah. You need to at least know what you're going to. And then, were it to be the case that on the sort of major issues of the day, Reform and the Conservative Party were broadly united on the key things, and it seems to me that an electoral alliance would sort of follow. Now, there was one thing that you did say you wanted to touch on. I'm intrigued by this. Daniel Booth asks, how will the Poles react to Starmer axing foreign aid and Farage's perceived lukewarm support for Ukraine? I predict, Daniel says, a 5 to 10% Labour reform reverse within weeks. I presume he means Labour going up because of Starmer's action, reform going down. But you mentioned at the top of the show about foreign aid, Tim, or was it just before we came on air?
Just before we came on air, I think.
This is something you're a bit of a unrepentant pinko lefty on, I understand.
I plead guilty, Your Honour, to that. No, I think I might be the last right-winger in the country who still believes in the aid budget. And I think some of it is misspent. A lot of it's misspent. A lot of government monies, budgets, full stop, are misspent. But I have seen for myself very hungry, very sick people sick with treatable diseases, helped by our aid budget. And I don't think it's too much to find 0.7% of GDP to help the people we share this planet with to lead better lives. Yet, when we're funding projects in China or India of dubious political correctness, of course I don't support that. But I still do believe in the aid budget. And I think actually, and private aid, if people say to me, well, you can give money still, Tim, if you don't want the government to give. And that's true. And I do, frankly. But I think there's something about long-term underpinning of bigger projects that only government can do. And so I still do support the aid budget. And I've had quite a lot of people say to me, well, why are you in Reform? You seem completely, because Reform certainly don't agree with me on that. But, we go back to where we started on immigration, on net zero, on tax, on crime, on wokeness. I'm absolutely a Reform member. But yeah, I think we're all allowed little areas, aren't we, where we're allowed to be a little bit different. And on the aid budget, I am in a different place than my party.
Well, let's see if we can finish on a point of agreement. I'm highly sceptical about the aid budget. I say some of it must do some good, but I think quite a lot of it does some harm. But why 0.7%? One of the things I hate is this carving up. We've now got this thing in our head about 2.5% on defence. It doesn't seem to me our defence need doubles if our GDP doubles, and our defence needs certainly don't halve if our GDP halves. We should be measuring these things in cash terms, not some. It's based on some bizarre commitment from the UN in the 1960s or something, isn't it? It's just
1973 at UN. I think it was UN. Yeah. So. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I was making the sort of broader point. If it took 0.7%, we can afford 0.7%, I think. But no, I think you decide fundamentally what the need is and how much it will, cost to meet that need. And it may well be that 0.4% is the right. I don't know. I have no idea. But and I'm sure 2.5% for defence is completely artificial as well. We need to spend what it takes. And I became a conservative in 1981. I was 11 when Mrs. Thatcher was involved in the whole unilateral nuclear disarmament debate, the stationing of missiles on Greenham Common for older members who remember that debate. And so defence is fundamentally, the defence of the realm. There's no more important job for a government than that. So I would put defence ahead of aid. But I do think we are. One day, I'm a Christian, Mark. One day, we're going to meet our Maker, and I think one of the questions that we all will be asked was: you lived on a planet where other people were starving. You lived on a planet where other people were dying from diseases that you were protected from. What did you do about it? And so, yeah, I still do believe in the aid budget.
Tim, let's just wrap up with a bit of a forecast. I know these are always a fool's.
Oh dear, I'm rubbish at these.
Yeah, but don't worry, because everybody forgets forecasts. And
no, they don't. Oh, I can tell you they don't.
Unless you happen to fluke it and get it bang on right, in which case you become a guru. One of my joys in recent weeks has been rewatching leading Democrat and other left-wing commentators in America, moving from firmly predicting that Kamala Harris is certain to win to their reaction as election night unfolds.
Well, I was going to say, people never remember predictions. I was going to give two words to you: Rory Stewart.
Yeah, that's true. But these fade over time. So give us a sketch. Look, I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire on exactly what you think the opinion poll ratings will be 12 months from now or whatever. But roughly 12 months from now, we would have been through the May elections, we would have been through the party conference season. We're sort of starting to get into the midterm of a parliament. Where are you anticipating we'll be? Are we now in a steady state of reform sort of getting close to its ceiling? Or will the Conservative Party fall still further? Or has the Conservative Party hit its floor and could now start to sort of bounce back if it, gets its house in order and gets some cut through? Where do you see us being if we're having this conversation a year from now? What will have changed?
Well, you can press me if you want to, but I'm going to slightly duck out of this one, Mark. What I will say is, I agree with the participant who's just asked that question. I think we will see a bit of a Labour bounce over the next few weeks. I actually do think Keir Starmer has played the last week very well. I got into a lot of trouble on Twitter for that, but I do think he has. I think he's been the adult in the room. He's trying to maintain relations with both his skeptics at home and Donald Trump. There's so many European leaders who rushed to Twitter to condemn Trump. He hasn't done that. He's tried to preserve strategic interests. I think there will be a benefit from that, but I don't think it will be a long-term benefit from it. If anything I know in politics is that if you basically fail to deliver domestically, you're done. And I don't see anything really in Starmer's agenda that would mean he will succeed domestically. So I admire what he's done in the last week. I thank him for it. But will there be any electoral dividends? We'll ask George Bush first, just for example, for winning the Gulf War, what good it did him. Ultimately, it's pocketbook, it's immigration, it's the cost of energy bills. That will decide the election. So I'm not going to make
that will just get worse and worse for Labour, right? So they might get a bounce this week, but in a year's time, when everybody's poorer and colder, opinion poll ratings will be lower and lower.
I tell you what, an opinion poll would be interesting to see the result of, and I expect you and I will agree on this. If you had to say, who's the most dangerous member of this government? David Lammy, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, or correct answer, Ed Miliband. Mm-hmm. Ed Miliband's, energy agenda, I think, is so dangerous. I think he really is Sun front page of old. To some people, the most dangerous man in Britain is Ed Miliband. He's got religion on climate change.
Well, it'll be a bit like that famous Sun headline from 1992 when they said, well, the last one to leave Britain, if Labour wins, switch out the lights. That won't apply to Miliband because all the lights will be out anyway, right? If he prevails by then, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So Labour down, and then do you think, our reform, now, I mean, it's very impressive to have got to sort of 25% of the vote. Some of the local council elections are impressive. There are going to be some tests in parliamentary by-elections, very likely. Can you see so an area where typically actually the predecessor parties like UKIP and underperformed in by-elections? They had that kind of SDP massive swing and sort of win a seat from nothing. I guess will that be pulled off by reform? And do you think we can find a way over the next year to keep relations between people who broadly agree on a lot of things in the two parties, you and I being a good example, to at least be on cordial and respectful terms? Because my view is by 2029, it is going to be an overriding national priority to remove this goddamn government, and people's precise colour of rosette is going to have to be left at the door.
Well, I think one of the worst things, let me answer it this way, Mark. One of the worst things that I think has happened to the right over the last 9 or so months since the general election has been the unpopularity of Labour. I think there should have been an awful lot more soul searching after that 2024 defeat. And I think Labour's unpopularity has given people on the right, both in Reform and the Conservatives, a sense that they're already done. Labour already defeated. Actually, if Labour have a little bit of recovery in the polls off the back of Starmer's international stage management, it may well be that the realisation that the next election isn't won, that it actually is quite hard work, might force both the Conservative and the Reform Party to be a little bit more aware of maybe the need to be aware of each other, maybe even be open to an alliance. So the next election really isn't decided. I think Labour are in a very vulnerable position. I think Keir Starmer lacks basic leadership qualities in a number of ways. I think Rachel Reeves is a disastrous chancellor. But there has been an assumption, I think, since Labour's popularity went into such a descent, that they will be beaten. That can't be taken for granted. And a little bit more sort of electoral realism might be good for better relations between Reform and the Tories. We will see.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent upon all good men and true to at least tilt the odds in our favour as best we can.
Yeah.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for everybody on the call. I got through as many of your questions as I could. Just a few advertisements before I thank Tim. Next Monday is our next Pop Conversation. I'll be joined by Kemi Badenoch's Chief of Staff, Lee Rowley, former Member of Parliament, to give his view from the Conservative side of the ledger here. So please do sign up for that. If you go to the chat box, there's a link where you can sign up there. Thanks to those of you who responded on our poll on the event this evening. If you aren't a member of the PopCon opinion panel, please consider joining. Every 2 or 3 weeks, we survey opinion on international domestic issues and party politics. So we'd love to hear your views. We're pretty good at getting them into the national media and certainly read by people at the top of the Conservative Party. So please do join our opinion panel if you're not there already. That's it. We've overrun a little, but Tim's happily ensconced in a pub, so I don't feel too bad about that. He might now want to have something a little stronger than a Coca-Cola. But Tim, it's been a real pleasure to join you. I look forward to meeting up in person rather than over Zoom soon. And thanks for giving us such food for thought. And I think a little bit of optimism that perhaps the right of centre can get their act together, and perhaps the 2029 government onwards will be a bit better than the 2010 government onwards if we get over the line. Thanks very much indeed, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you all the people who've given up some of their Monday evening to be with us.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great night. Over and out.